Hi, I'm Al Dominic, and as we look ahead to 2020, I'm joined in New York City by Tom Michaud, the CEO of Keefe, Bruyette & Woods, a Stifel company. KBW, as it's known, is a boutique investment bank and broker-dealer that specializes in the financial services sector. I invited Tom to join me today to get his perspective on the state of banking here in the United States. With some $18 trillion in assets, this industry is big, broad, and incredibly influential. So Tom, I have 5 questions for you today, starting with one about the 4 biggest banks here. What are the trends you and your colleagues are paying most attention to as we head towards 2020?
Well, first of all, it's great to be with you today. And the trends that I think that is most impressive for the big 4 banks is how well they have recovered since the global financial crisis. I believe that their recovery is complete. You can see it in the profitability of some of those 4 companies, especially at JP Morgan and Bank of America. And you can see it in their balance sheets, which is they've had probably the most capital they've ever had at the moment. So they've done a very nice job of rebounding in terms of balance sheet strength, as well as in terms of profitability since the crisis, and also their market share is up.
Sure, and their size is pretty significant when you look at the entire banking sector.
Yes, and I like to look at it in broad increments. If you go back to the financial crisis and you said, okay, we're going through a terrible economy right now, there is a banking crisis, what is the industry going to look like 10 years later? I think you would have thought that the biggest banks that were right at the epicenter of the crisis weren't going to pick up as much share as they had, but that has in fact been what has happened.
Right. Well, so size and scale have been kind of 2 key topics or themes that have been used in the industry to talk about merger activity. Maybe I could ask you to look ahead to 2020 and what you think M&A is going to be.
Well, first of all, you talked about size and scale. That is really important because for the first time in my 34-year career, the biggest banks are some of the most profitable banks in the country. That had always been the argument that the bigger that they are, the more diversified they are, the more profitable they would be. That didn't happen, but it is happening right now, and we think it will continue to happen. And so this drive for scale is a powerful force in the consolidation of the banking industry. And then the other big factor for the banking industry right now is that we're a year beyond the passage of the Crapo bill, almost a year beyond. And remember, Dodd-Frank put in place a very significant barrier at $50 billion in assets for more regulation. When the Crapo bill was passed, that barrier was removed. And not surprisingly, now you're seeing consolidation happen, and you're seeing very strong regional champions merge together to go through the $50 billion mark, to create more scale, to compete more with the bigger banks. So I think that is the underlying theme, and you're seeing more of the action in that mid-size category than you had seen previously. Previously, it was in very small banks.
Mm-hmm. So you see those mergers of equals being a little bit more favorable?
Well, now you're talking about merger of equals, which is a whole different category. So up until this time period in bank consolidation, it was very typical for the buyer to pay a premium for the seller and then to go ahead and run the combined company. What we're seeing now, because these are very large banks that are relatively similar in size, we are seeing them to come together with more of a merger approach rather than an acquisition approach, which means that there is not as much or any first day premium to one set of shareholders, but the idea is to build a higher performing company on a combined basis. And what we like about this era is that those stocks are performing better than many of the stocks where a premium was paid. So investors seem to like it, and they see the future potential of these companies.
Interesting. So again, we're looking ahead to 2020, and we're talking right now about traditional incumbent players and what their activity is. Talk to me a little bit about what's going on in the fintech community.
So the fintech community, it's a really hot sector right now. And if I were to build a pyramid of like what's the hottest piece of it, it's really payments. We hear a lot of conversation around what's happening in the payment space, because the payment space is where a client, mainly a retail client, but could be a commercial client, is interacting and where they may think their banking relationship is. So we're seeing a lot of attention there. We're also seeing a lot of attention to technologies that'll help make banks more efficient, because that is going to be the need for a successful company in the future. But it is a very, very active space in terms of investment dollars and strategic discussion by the banking industry.
Yeah, we saw some big names today. Google and Facebook both were in the news for their payment approach and their interest in doing more with the consumer. So I think you're right, it bears watching.
It does appear to be watched. But one thing I'll tell you that's happened in this whole cycle with fintech is that if you want to get into the banking system, you need to play by the bank regulatory rules. And I think that whole discussion around the fintech charter with the new charter is really at the epicenter, and you could see it. That there are laws in the United States around Bank Secrecy Act, anti-money laundering, that's all embedded inside the Patriot Act. You can't be a fintech company and start opening banking accounts and ignore that.
Yeah.
So I think it's going to have to happen in conjunction with the banking system.
Yeah, and it seems like things are starting to really come together in meaningful ways.
They are. They really are.
So, we're here in New York. We're at NASDAQ's market site in Times Square. I'd be remiss not to ask you about IPO activity. In the past, we've talked a little bit about companies that were lining up to go public. Those, again, were kind of traditional banks. What do you see in the financial sector broadly? Do you see more IPO potential activity, be it from the traditional banks that are private that want to go public, or from the fintech space or something else?
Well, I think there will still be private companies that elect for one reason or another to go public. My firm was the lead IPO manager on the two biggest bank IPOs of the year. They were both very high performing banks, and they just felt it was their time and their corporate history to go to the public markets. I don't think there's going to be a giant wave of bank IPOs, mainly because the industry is very well capitalized at the moment, and there's not really that need for capital to the extent that there was maybe in prior cycles, because we're starting with so much more capital. Sure. I think the action's going to be more towards that fintech space where there's a lot of growth and a lot of interest at accessing capital for growth.
Well, let me wrap up with this question. You talk about fintech, you talk about IPOs. What about these de novos that are being chartered or have the potential to go live at some point in the first or second quarter of next year? You see this in DC, New York, out on the West Coast, these ideas that entrepreneurs are bringing forward to create a new bank. What do you think about those?
I think they're going to be few and far between, frankly. I think there will be some, but I think if you were to come, we remember previously we were talking about scale. Mm-hmm. These startup companies don't have scale. And not only that, but the banking companies who are in the public markets, their stocks have sold off. They're not that much more expensive than what investors have to pay for a startup, for example. So my view is that there will be some that are really targeted, really focused with experienced management teams that can succeed. But I think any of these startups that are taking a very general approach to banking are probably going to have a harder time because of the argument and the drive for scale that is also working in the industry. So there will be some, but I don't think there will be many.
Yeah. Well, Tom, it's always a pleasure to talk with you about banking and what's happening in the upcoming months. Thanks for joining us here on set. Thanks for looking ahead. I'm Al Dominick. We'll see you again on our next episode.